this evening, we're going to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've divided up the evening trying to follow what you had requested last week in terms of what a comfortable class format might look like. And again, if I lose sound, because I did last class, just please wave your hands madly in the air like this. Don't drop off. Just assume it's me and try to get my attention as I'm barreling through this lecture. I'm going to try and get as far as I can in the lecture, but as you can imagine, there's a fair amount of content with SDGs to go over. So I'll do my best to try to fit in everything this evening. If not, it'll spill over into our next lecture, which is fine. Last week, we went over the course syllabus, and Sarah pointed out that the midterm date had not been updated from the earlier draft that I made. So we need to clarify that the reading week, as I'm sure you know, I didn't know, is the 12th to the 16th of October. And the midterm will be either the week before or the week after. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna shoot you a poll on the Zoom here. And very simple one. And it's asking you, do you wanna do the midterm before the reading week or do you wanna do it after the reading week? Apparently it's my choice, they said. So I'll let you guys decide. Let's say majority rules. Okay, so I'll end that and I'll share the results. There you go. So the majority of people want it after the reading week. I made this anonymous because I don't want to put anyone on the spot. If you really have an issue doing it after the reading week, the two of you that actually wanted it before, maybe contact me after the class or during office hours and we can try to work out something with your schedule. But you know, if that's okay with everyone, we'll just do it after the reading week then. So stop sharing. Okay, we also last week had an opportunity to discuss the international aid framework and how the movement of financial resources between countries impacts project development, how project aid and budget aid, or what we call government-to-government financial support, impacts development, and the pros and cons of each of these two instruments of aid. We also discussed the definition of our two principal objects of this course, obviously the project and management. And we went over the triple constraint of project management. I won't test you on that, but that was time, cost, and scope. Most of you got it. And elaborated on how they impact one another. We then concluded with a brief overview of what constitutes a good project manager in the development context, and the characteristics that are defined by one's cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, and cultural intelligence. At the end of the lecture, I set an assignment for you to provide feedback on a visual of a broken footbridge and to define what the development challenge is that is reflected in that photo. And this is an activity that I'll be doing throughout the course as part of participation in order to provoke discussion, analysis, and problem solving. And I had a lot of good feedback from you. I just want to give you that little bit of feedback, some of which I'm going to share on a slide here, a good chunk of it actually. And really, it was a really good start to problem solving and analysis. And my only suggestion is that when you raise an issue or a question, all of which are valid, all of your points were valid, I just want you to try taking it a step further. So I'll give you an example of something that one person raised, which was really good. They said that someone was suggesting that school kids think it's worth risking their life to go to school. It's a really good thought, and I would have naturally asked the field extension workers who said that, why is that? Why are they taking that risk to go to school? Did the community receive some kind of socialization training from an NGO? Is school attendance mandatory? Maybe it's mandated by the government. Did the parents go to school and so they're trying to encourage their children to as well? Just try to take it to the next notch in your analysis. But overall, really great stuff. So we've got, I'll just run through it because it's worth looking at. Getting medical attention, foregoing one set of activities for another. This means people have difficult choices that they have to make when they're facing an obstacle like this. They have reduced opportunities for livelihood because many of their livelihoods may be cut off. There's emotional and mental well-being to think about because a lot of families will be very stressed by this. It's clear there's no schools nearby, probably quite far to get to. They're taking unnecessary risks, especially laborers. And when you look at the ILO standards, they have benchmarks for best practices in labor policies for worldwide. And clearly this is not one of them. Local government may not be able or willing to repair infrastructure. I thought that was a really good point. So they went on to say, what other obstacles are they facing? If they're not fixing something as important as this, what's the state of their clinics? What's the state of their other basic services in the community? An area we could explore. They've got poor infrastructure, and so it may have become normalized in their village. I thought that was really good because it's a behavioral change that maybe is just what it is. We'll just accept it, we'll climb over it like we are, or we'll find a way around it. But you start to normalize bad behavior and you normalize harmful practices in your community. So that was really very profound. There's poor access to goods and services. A lot of people answered that way. Risky access that could cut off any time. I saw this as a disaster mitigation issue because that bridge, as one person pointed out, could collapse at any time. It's like having a boulder over your head while you're working. It could topple at any moment. And somebody raised the question, why don't communities get together and try to work out a solution to this and maybe improve transport routes? And I thought that was really good. And finally, this one, really struck home for me, is a remote community is now even more remote. And today we're going to be talking about leaving no one behind in the Sustainable Development Goals. We're also going to be looking at how to access the most marginalized, most vulnerable people in the population. So that was a really good observation as well. So as a project manager in these types of contexts, it's really important to see past the goalposts, the immediate outputs that result from a project. And this is really going to be the meat of this class to prepare you for the realities of field work outside all the theory of project management in the development context and really into the deep end of project community practice, so to speak. So last week I stated several times that a bridge can be just a bridge. We develop a blueprint, we arrange the steps and activities, the resources we need, our timeline, time, cost, and scope. But for the seasoned development worker, you see much more. You see children trying to get to school. You see a lot of unaccompanied kids. They're at risk of drowning, possibly eaten by crocodiles, indicating all sorts of child protection issues. You see a little baby on the back of one of the children there, and that child who's carrying the baby, she's a student. So perhaps, we're guessing, but perhaps her job is to take her baby sister to her auntie's house to take care of her while her mother is working in the field. And there's also a day laborer making his way to work. So we know there are potentially market issues, job issues for him. And we can assume that many mothers can't take care of the little ones because they're engaged in productive work as well, or that logistics and supply chains have been cut off to the village. And one of you said rightly, it made the village even more remote now than ever. So our seasoned project manager might also see the things that are not there. So we talked about what is there. What's not there? Like the cattle that usually move back and forth, donkeys that carry vital supplies for villages, bikes and motorcycles even use this bridge, if you can believe it. And they take milk or produce to markets. And we'll also assume that some women and girls just won't feel safe crossing at this point. So they might be walking long distances to other bridges where they can cross more safely. This will take them outside of their normal routes and the protection of their village, which is really important in these societies. So they're at risk of gender-based violence. So overall, what stands out in all of our collective observations, everything you submitted, if we were asked to come and replace that bridge, say by the Canadian government, Global Affairs Canada, say they were asking for this, well, what we'd see is, first off, barriers to girls' education, and we would be talking about this in our proposal. There are a few girls in the photo, clearly, but there were also a lot that were probably pulled from school. And perhaps they were put in the field to work until the bridge was repaired. You know that women do a lot of the agricultural work in a society like this, and that becomes an infringement on their right to education as children. We might also be observing a barrier to accessing quality health services. So, one, professionals can't travel in and out of the village. Vehicles can't get over the bridge to carry those needed supplies. Pregnant women can't get to clinics for safe deliveries and maternal and child health care. We also observe that problem I mentioned related to child protection because huge risks are being taken by these kids every day, at least the ones who are going to school. There's a lot who aren't. And those who aren't, there is a possibility of girls facing gender-based violence due to working in the field when they should be at school. It might promote harmful traditional practices. Parents get used to their daughters being at home or being local and not sending them to school. It might lead to earlier marriages. In this country, for instance, early marriages at around 10 or 12 years of age is very common. In addition to that, we know there's been huge spikes in domestic violence, and that often happens when the mothers and the children are at home. Overall, as we stand there looking at this bridge, and why I asked you to visualize it, to reflect on it, we also want to check if more boys than girls are using the bridge to get to school. If they are, we note that there is a rising inequality in how girls could access vital services and fulfill their basic right to education and health. And so this becomes a major gender equality issue that will need to be addressed with that bridge. So again, I say, at risk of repeating myself many times, a bridge is just a bridge. But as you begin to train yourself in the field of international development and you begin to appreciate the complexities of poverty alleviation, that is how it relates to, let's say, justice, to equality, to gender, to reducing harmful practices, and so on, infrastructure development like a bridge actually takes on a very different image. And you can say this is true of most infrastructure projects around the world, whether related to water and sanitation, to health services, to education facilities, to housing, bridges, roads, and so on. There are layers and layers of issues and needs that exist and will affect each other. And I'll be talking a bit more about that in this lecture. So just a good start, everyone. I just wanted to relay that to you, that you all came back with some really amazing feedback. And I'd urge you to continue probing further, asking those tough questions. And we'll have some more photos like that to examine over the course of this class. So I'll be coming back to you a bit more with similar types of photos.
I just have a quick question.
Of course, Rebecca, go ahead.
I might have missed, since I wasn't here last week. Do we know where this picture was taken, like what country or region it was taken in?
Yes, Indonesia.
Indonesia, okay.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm going to come back to it at the end of the class, Rebecca, because this is going to be part of your first assignment as well. And I'll be outlining a few of those things.
Okay.
So yeah, good question. Thanks. So I'm going to give you an example of a project where there were these many interrelated themes. A personal example. In Bangladesh, I ran at that time, Canada's largest bilateral project in the world. It was called the Rural Maintenance Program, a very exciting project. It was about $37 million a year and was essentially a rural roads project, maintaining earthen roads that were deemed by the government as commercially important across the country. What I didn't realize in the 4 years that I was there as the RMP project manager was that Bangladesh was on track to meeting its Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, in water and sanitation. For me, that was incredibly surprising to find that out for such a very poor nation. You would expect, even India wasn't able to meet their objectives in water and sanitation. No one thought about it, the impact from improved roads across the country. But rickshaw drivers, if you haven't seen a rickshaw, it's like this. These three-wheel delivery vehicles were the main conduit for transporting latrine components. It's these big cement rings, they call it. And they would transport it to remote villages. And they couldn't move along these earthen roads that were often in disrepair, especially during the monsoon season. So they had, for a long time, fallen behind in their goal because they simply couldn't access the communities. My project, which had started up on Earth and Roads, had inadvertently accelerated their progress in water and sanitation by repairing 32,000 kilometers of earth and roads across the country. And I ended up advancing a completely different sector from what I was working in. So from our side, as a project manager, I called it an unintended outcome from the project. But as it turned out, it was really much more than that. And in the end, we actually won an award for Best Infrastructure Project funded by Canada for that year, which I felt was no deliberate effort on my part because we didn't even realize it at the beginning. But you know, who was I to contradict the award planners? When I received the award, I knew this outcome was going to happen. At least that was my story, and I stuck to it. And it's really what you discover, an interconnected industry that we work in. And it's up to the quality project managers that we place in the field to really conduct the orchestra, so to speak, make sure all the instruments are playing off the same music sheet. And I'm going to circle back to the bridge photo at the end of our lecture when we talk about the next assignment. So before I go into the SDGs this evening, I just want to stop there to see if anyone has any questions or any other reflections on what we have discussed in this photo or what I've been talking about so far, or anything you'd like to add at this point. Don't be shy. And feel free to use the chat if you don't want to unmute your microphone. That's an easy way to do it sometimes. Okay, so this evening we're going to spend a bit of time discussing another global strategy that's pulling together all of the diverse development targets and having a profound effect on how we manage projects overseas and at home. So I'm going to first off start by launching another poll here. If I can find it, there we go. And it's basically just to see if you've studied the SDGs. I don't want to belabor them if you have studied them, and I can skip over some of the details to avoid repeating it. And you can obviously do a lot of reading on them online at the UN website as well. Okay. Okay. So we have, I'll share this with you as well. So we have a couple who are very familiar and 3 who are sort of familiar or not at all. Okay, that's fair. Okay, and maybe a little bit later on, in fact, I'm going to share a resource that you can download on your phone if you want as well, which can help you understand the SDGs a bit more. But what I want to do is discuss the SDGs in the context of international development projects and ways that field and policy experts can view the goals, the SDGs, in terms of implementation and putting SDGs into action through effective project designs. Okay, so it's going to relate very specifically to our subject. So that's the context in which we're going to be looking at the SDGs. But what I would like to do is a quick refresher. I know a couple of you really know them well, but this is just to jog your memory and your knowledge of the SDGs. So I'll just fire this off. Great. That's a little more interesting way to do it than me trying to list off all the SDGs for you. We have 17 goals for the 2030 agenda in order to transform our world. But first off, why did we even need an agenda or strategy for dealing with all of the world's issues? That's a question for you. Maybe you can use the chat. What do you think? Why did we really need the SDG agenda when it came out in 2015? Anyone want to take a stab?
Just because it gives individuals a goal to head towards. If there's no goal in sight or place people want to be in the future, individuals, countries might not think about them or try to go for them at all.
Right. Yeah, that's important. Yeah. Good. And in the chat, we have someone, Sarah, who said no active progress was being made. That's possible. There were a lot of criticisms against the MDGs at that time. In fact, they changed a lot of the baselines of the MDGs in the last 2 years before they finished, which I thought was quite interesting. It's a bit like lowering the poverty line we talked about. Here, you just change your baseline so your achievements are a little better. We know in project management, you're not supposed to do that. Well, okay, great. So a couple of good responses there. And, you know, put very simply, we have a risk of inequalities in and between countries. We have depletion of our natural resources. We have rising population. We have climate change. And drilling deeper, you know, we see cities, especially in the developing world, that are splitting at the seams from overpopulation, causing their water supplies to dry up. Their sewage is unable to take the strain, and corruption and violence are rising. So it was deemed an essential strategy by the UN to make sure that we had a natural successor to the Millennium Development Goals, which were initiated in 2000, the MDGs. They ended in 2015. But the key differences are that SDGs needed to be more inclusive, and they had to involve the stakeholders who were the object of the goals. And as we'll see later, there are a lot of new players in the activities that would help reach those goals. These were all new players. And probably most importantly, the countries who were the target of the MDGs in the last agenda, they were involved in the process of the SDGs and this new agenda. And it included developed countries as well as underdeveloped countries. This was all really different from the previous MDGs. So no country was just a target of the goals. Now they were a participant and an owner of the goals. So you can see that this was a fundamentally different approach from the MDGs. And the SDGs are, in essence, the world strategy. It's all of ours. It's the global agenda for 2030, or whatever we want to call it. But it's to put in place a vision for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. That's how the UN describes it. And whatever you think of the MDGs, and believe me, I have a lot of opinions on the MDGs, good and bad, the SDGs were not picked out of the air as some sort of good idea, as you said. We really needed them. They were part of a massive undertaking of consultation. Almost everyone who is involved in development, that's the academics, the practitioners, the private sector, governments, even the public, were invited to provide input on the SDGs. And then they were refined over time. They were boiled down. They were even changed at the last minute. And they went through the meat grinder of politics and economics and social justice groups and lobby groups. And then after all of this processing and churning, they had to go through the approval of every country on the planet in the General Assembly of the UN. Can you imagine? And this included developed and underdeveloped countries, countries at war, countries in a fragile state, countries suffering from huge disasters, countries friendly, countries unfriendly, and there are a few of those. And at the end of the day, the incredible achievement was that everyone signed on. Now, some argue this is our best agenda for ending poverty. If you talk to some other people, they'll say this is our only agenda for ending poverty by 2030. The question is, will we get there? That remains to be seen, and we're going to talk a bit about that this evening as well. Let's have a look one more time. Oops, not that. I'm just going to take you to another video just to understand this a bit from some celebrities.
We can be.
We must be the first generation
to end extreme poverty.
The generation
Most determined
to fight injustice
and inequalities.
The generation that saves the planet from climate change.
And this is how it will get done.
The global goals.
A 15-year plan
For everyone, everywhere.
with no one left behind.
We will live in a world
Where nobody
anywhere lives in extreme poverty.
Where no one
goes hungry.
Where no one
wakes in the morning
Asking if there will be food today.
We will live in a world where no child has to die of
Diseases we know how to cure.
and where proper health care
is a lifelong right for us all.
We will live in a world
Where everyone
goes to school.
and education gives us the knowledge
and skills
for a fulfilling life.
We will live in a world where all girls and all women have equal opportunities
to thrive
And be powerful
and safe.
we cannot succeed if half the world is condemned.
We will live in a world
Where all people can get clean water.
And proper toilets
at home, at school, and at work.
We will live in a world where there is sustainable energy for everyone.
heat, light,
and power for the whole planet.
Without destroying the planet.
We will live in a world where economies prosper.
a new wealth.
Lead to decent jobs
For everyone.
And we will live in a world where our industry
Our infrastructure and our
Best innovations.
Are not just used to make money, but to make all our lives better.
we will live in a world
Where prejudices and extremes of inequality
Are defeated.
inside our countries
And between different countries.
where people live in cities and communities
that are safe, progressive,
and support everyone who lives there.
where we replace
What we consume.
Planet where we put back what we take out of the earth.
We live in a world that is decisively rolling back from climate
change.
where we restore and protect the life in our oceans and seas.
restore, and protect
Life on land.
The forests.
Almost the earth itself.
With peace between and inside countries.
Where all governments are open.
And answer to us for what they do at home and abroad.
And the justice rules.
With everyone equal before the law.
where all countries and we their people
Work together.
in partnerships of all kinds
To make these goals a reality.
These are the United Nations global goals.
For sustainable development.
Let's get to work.
I don't know if you guys noticed, it was very sad to see Chadwick Boseman there. You probably saw him. I think it was SDG 8. He was the fellow who played Black Panther. He was so young to be cut down. Every time I see that, it's sad. You know, for a lot of people, there's going to be even a favorite SDG. Mine are, just so you know, and ones that I tend to specialize or spend more time on than others, are goals number 5, which is gender equality. Goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And of course, quality education, which is SDG 4, and partnerships is a big one for me as well, which is goal number 17. So, as you know, the SDGs consist of 17 goals and 169 targets, which were described by the UN as an urgent call for action by all countries in a global partnership. This means that everyone signed on to the goals, whether they liked it or not, and many didn't like it, by the way, or at least they weren't ready to monitor the results. They weren't set up and prepared for it. And as I mentioned, it includes both developing and developed countries. So even Canada submits its voluntary national report, or what's called the VNR, at regular intervals to report on our progress against all of the goals. The goals recognize that ending poverty is linked to improving health, education, inequality, economic growth, climate change, or actually I'm going to call that climate emergency, call it for what it is, and preserving oceans and forests and so on. Everything is linked together. As I mentioned in that Bangladesh project example, every goal has an impact on the other goals. And of course, ultimately, everything links back to goal number 1, which is ending poverty by 2030. There are all sorts of ways of slicing and dicing the SDGs depending on your focus, your sector, your interest. When I look at SDGs from the perspective of a project manager, I can categorize them in terms of those that impact my sphere directly, my sphere of influence, and ones I have some control over, and those that are more national or global in nature, some of which are even way out of my direct control. And there are different ways to do this. Everyone has their preference. They have their cute models. Mine is pretty bland, but it gets to the point. It looks at dividing the goals based on individual benefit, societal, environmental, and global. So I break down the goals in terms of my own sphere of influence, how I see myself contributing. Ultimately, we must all do this exercise because the goals can seem really daunting and unreachable to us if we don't. How are we going to contribute to these goals? That's the key question. So let's go through different levels, each of these levels. You have first the individual level. We have those things which would benefit people the most, which is ending poverty, ending hunger, ensuring good health and well-being, quality education. And by the way, education is now different from the MDGs. In the MDGs, we were talking about access to education. Now it's access to quality education. So quality was added as a new element. And the individual level ensures decent work and economic growth as well. So that includes jobs and non-exploitative labor, basically. Now let's go up. We go to the societal or community level. The goals are still pretty much in my purview as a project manager. The goals focus on reduced inequalities, gender equality, peace, justice, building strong institutions, including, and these would include women's organizations, capacity of local institutions, community-based organizations, youth agency, and that sort of thing. And this comes straight out of our discussion on the photo earlier. They're goals that are still within our direct reach as project managers. And as we move farther from my sphere of influence, the other categories are environment. And here we have a couple of things which I can still contribute to on more or less on a community level, let's say. Clean water and sanitation still has a lot of elements that are still in my domain. There's clean energy, where I can contribute to innovations, but not so much to research or scaling up programs, perhaps on a very large national scale. But I can switch from power grids to solar in my projects. I can look at sustainable farming practices. I can introduce the use of biomass and things like that. So there are things that are within my control, even at this level. But certainly as we start to get up to sustainable cities, industry, infrastructure, and responsible production and consumption, it's now a bit more out of my direct reach. So at this level, if I were looking to find a way to control that level, I can exert a lot more influence than I can exert my technical or my managerial expertise or my control. But it takes, for me, a lot more creativity and energy for me to take on that role. But I don't want you to underestimate influence either. You don't need to be a well-known specialist as a project manager to be an influencer, I'm sure, as you well know. And a great example of that, one of my heroes, albeit she's very young, is Greta Thunberg, advocating for the climate emergency. And you've probably seen her here in Canada. Amazing, amazing girl. And as we move to the global level, I often hear a lot on the news about life below water or oceans warming, slowing ocean currents, depletion of fishing stock, global warming, climate change. And here's where I get a lot more nervous because I'm not an activist. Okay, I really admire those who are, like Greta, but I'm a humble project manager that has to walk a fine line between politics, economics, communities, and private sector interests most of the time. And there's a huge role for activism and lobbying, but I find that's quite difficult in a mainstream project framework that has donors, often institutional donors who have, like governments, who have foreign policies that often don't take kindly to having essentially loudspeakers in their funded projects. They don't want you doing that. So we keep it mostly to campaigning in communities, running national awareness campaigns, things like that. But really, kudos, big shout out to the organizations that are built for that purpose. Organizations like Greenpeace, Oxfam, Wildlife Federation, the Mining Watch, many others who watch the corporate world and ensure they're keeping in step with the SDGs as we go along. We need those watchdogs for sure. So let's consider for a moment, when we say sustainable development goals, first, what is your understanding of the term sustainable development? And I'm just going to open it up to a general discussion just for a few minutes to hear your ideas and thoughts. You can use the chat box or unmute your mic. What is sustainable development for you?
For me, I feel like sustainable development is just development that is long lasting and like that, yeah, is beneficial in the long run, not just the short run.
Right. Definitely. Something that can exist post-project or post-activity for sure. Vanessa's writing development that can be upheld over time. Self-sustaining from Joshua. Development goals that will maintain their effect in years to come. Yeah, so all with sort of a time frame attached to it, some sort of longevity that's attached to it. Great. Well,
I think too, if I could add,
please.
Along with development being sustainable for like the long run, I also think if an organization or group of people goes in to do some sort of project, also having that development and project being sustainable for the future, but without people that are originally brought it there. So making sure that the community will be able to like uphold it on their own, if that makes sense.
Right. So it's owned by the community, and they can.
And they know how, you know, the ins and outs of it and know how to sustain it on their own.
Absolutely. Yeah, the people, the institutions, the local government, or even the local community decision makers. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Well, all of that is really good. And, you know, this term is a really important one, probably one of the most important terms that you'll come across all the time in international development. You'll hear everyone talking about this. It's definitely something worth looking at, worth committing to memory, and understanding before you start any kind of development work. Every project, every initiative, every pilot, every innovation, every donor most definitely will ask you a question on sustainability. So you'll be ready to respond to that. And you'll be called on to describe the steps leading to sustainability of your project, how you'll measure it, things like that. And another way to frame the question is, how will your project results continue after the project is closed? And how will you know that they have continued? Because they always want you to come back and justify that response. So normally this is something that's described in your project document, and we'll be getting into that in later classes. That's a document which we refer to as a PRODOC, just means project document, PRODOC. And through the SDG process, the UN declared a global definition that included the three things: economic growth, environmental protection, and social inclusion. And within this, I call it a triumvirate of development, to use old Roman language. And we recognize that we must meet the basic needs of human society, which are life-saving aid, basic services, the humanitarian imperative, but without compromising the future for other generations so that they can meet their needs. Of course, that's also, keep in mind, assuming that future generations are going to be using the environment sustainably themselves. It's a big assumption. And as I mentioned earlier, this involves the responsible use of resources for consumption and production without hurting the environment and while protecting our planet as well. And you know, if you consider that in the next 20 years, the economies of the world could double. Infrastructure will likely double to meet the growing demand. Populations will double in the next, let's say, 30 years or so. And within this framework, we have to meet our greenhouse gas emissions. We have to reduce targets. We have to meet targets in order to avoid global warming. So you see the problem. It's a complex because we have to be responsible, but at the same time, very aggressive to respond to the growing needs of a bigger population. And to meet the production and consumption demand, we can argue there are 4 types of capital that we would have to consider that are all in play at the same time. And you'll come across these in your projects as well. And this capital is directed at growth and expansion. So the first one is human capital. This is the obvious one, right? It's skills development, essentially, technical and non-technical, life management skills, things like that. And we're helping to get young people ready for productive jobs. So in your projects, you won't avoid this incredibly important part of project design and building the capacity of people. The next capital would be social capital. Now, this would include things like health and education and other basic services that would be supporting the community. And here, we're interested in achieving access to services and, as mentioned before, the quality of those services being delivered as well, so that these services meet the growing demand of the communities around the world, but also meet the appropriate demand of the communities, especially for gender-sensitive programs. The third is natural capital. This is our environment and our climate. So more and more, we're recognizing the need for projects that address the adaptation to climate change, projects that build resilience in communities to withstand shocks, ensuring that people, communities have access to natural resources that they need to grow food and to make a reasonable income as well. And then finally, really big one, physical capital. And for the most part, we can say this is infrastructure. Meeting the needs of that growing population in cities, that growing urbanization demand that's occurring, and where there's diminishing water supply, drainage issues, waste management, and all of those challenges. And natural and physical capital relate to each other very closely. That's pretty obvious. For example, if physical capital destroys natural capital, then we can't have sustainable growth. There is no sustainability. So you'll see that's why Global Affairs Canada introduced the Environmental Assessment Act a few years ago. It's now introduced into all Canadian funded projects to analyze the possible detrimental effects of a project and how to remedy it. So things like water runoff, disposal of biohazards if you're doing a clinic construction, soil degradation if you're doing agriculture, and things like that. But it's fair to say that within a project, you'll be overseeing all these types of capital in order to manage what we refer to as a sustainable project. So whether in a role of the project policy analyst, or ultimately if you're a project manager who will implement whatever's designed, you'll be assessing investments that will be made that can either destroy or build resilience against natural disasters, degradation, pandemics, shocks of any kind, basically. You're building resilience in communities. And right now, the big challenge to our projects overseas is figuring out how to implement them in a highly volatile health risk environment and to find remote monitoring options to measure results in areas basically that are locked down or are really difficult to access right now because of COVID. Local staff, as I'm finding in many countries now, I've just got off the phone this morning to Uganda, they're finding it really hard to move around in the villages. Women and girls, they reported, are having their mobility severely restricted. And increasingly, they're unable to have their voice heard in decisions that affect them in their communities. So some of this capability as a project manager, you can say, is learned through your studies. Other parts are through your experience in the field, and still other parts are, due to this thing we called emotional intelligence. And that basically comes down to your empathy, your personal resilience to tackling these complex problems. And keeping in mind, these are fraught with failure often, these projects. So you have to also face that. And you're facing tragedy in communities almost every day. So just to put this in context, I want to give you, don't want that to run. I just want to give you a couple of examples, but before I do, I'll just pause for a minute to see if there's any questions up to this point. If anyone, just go ahead, just unmute.
Sorry, just for those capitals, you would label them as the 4 capitals of a sustainable project?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Nicholas. Okay. So one example of this, I'm gonna get into now talking a bit more about infrastructure, because I want to give you a couple of examples of how this interplay takes place between physical and natural capital. So one example of interrelation of the SDGs is exactly that. And it's really a significant initiative of the World Bank and other investment banks to increase infrastructure in the world. So if you go to Africa or Asia, you're going to see countries in a constant state of construction. It's unbelievable just how much construction is going on. So I'll play you a really short clip to explain this one, just to understand SDG 9 on infrastructure. I'll play it because it's an interesting clip from some young people who are engaging in an initiative called World Merit. And it's an initiative that aims to challenge young people to think about what really matters in their world. It's short and entertaining, but it really tells you enough for the purpose for this evening.
The United Nations' 9th Sustainable Development Goal is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. The UN wants to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. There's a huge lack of infrastructure in many countries, especially developing countries, causing limitations of the bare necessities like sanitation, healthcare, and communications. For this reason, the main objective is for the global standard of infrastructure to increase substantially. 2.5 billion people lack access to basic sanitation, and almost 800 million people lack access to water. These and many other problems are what occur from inadequate infrastructure, which is why the UN hopes to develop and retrofit infrastructure, especially in developing countries.
Infrastructure and industrialization are also important for employment and the economy. Lack of infrastructure reduces access to markets, jobs, information, and training, causing a large barrier when it comes to business. With a stronger infrastructure, there will be an increase in jobs and business opportunities, which will have a positive impact on the economy and society. Every job in manufacturing creates 2.2 jobs in other sectors, which means less of the population will suffer from unemployment and poverty.
There are also improvements needed in general and domestic technology. About 2.6 billion people in the developing world have difficulties accessing electricity 24/7. This means many homes don't have the ability to clean or cook, which negatively affects health. Which is why by 2020, the UN strive to provide universal and affordable access to the internet. And that's what you should know about the UN's 9th Sustainable Development Goal. So what are you going to do about it? Check out members.worldmerit.org, and thanks for watching.
Okay, I couldn't have put it better myself. And this segues into the interplay between the Sustainable Development Goals again. So let me give you another example that relates, it relates to one of the biggest initiatives of planning investments in infrastructure to meet growing demand around the world. And it has to do with that big news story that we've all been hearing about, carbon emissions. And we've heard the ads, and we know that we can all make a personal effort to curb our personal carbon emissions. But what's the bigger stake at play in this sector? This is going to give you some comparative data just to get an understanding, an idea of how we can personally impact the environment and how we can professionally impact it as a global sector. So for example, if you don't drive a car for a year, you can save 3 tons of carbon. And if we stop eating meat and dairy, you can save about 2 tons a year. And if you don't fly across the Atlantic to Europe, you can save about 1 ton per trip, roughly. But let's consider the construction industry. All right, if we go to that sector. When you build one building, one skyscraper, okay, an average size building, anywhere up to 100,000 tons of carbon emissions are produced. That's the cement, the steel, the machinery, and things like that. And that's like saying you save, 100,000 flights to France, or not eating meat and dairy for 50,000 years, basically. Or let's say 50,000 people not eating meat and dairy for a year. Or just over 16,000 cars left in the driveway all year. And then you start to realize it's staggering, considering the number of buildings that are being built in the world right now. And just before we move on for bonus points, does anyone know what city this is? Just unmute your mic.
Dubai.
Is it Dubai?
Yeah, it's Dubai. Okay, you get extra brownie points if you can name the big tall building in the middle. Used to be one of the tallest. I think it's being passed now. That is don't look on Google. That's the Burj Khalifa. Burj Khalifa, exactly, yeah. That one resulted in 250,000 tons of carbon emissions, if you believe that. It's 2.5 times a normal skyscraper. So it really puts things in perspective. And an entire city of Dubai, that whole city you see there is the new Dubai. And when I went through there a few years ago, it was built and not a single person was living in it. And if you go to China, you'll see ghost cities. You'll go into a city, has all the Starbucks and McDonald's signs, but they're all fake. Nobody's living there. It's just infrastructure programs to keep people in jobs and to keep that economy moving and growing. So it really puts things in perspective when you think how much construction is going on. But now I want to add one additional complication to this relationship of infrastructure and climate. So first, a lot of construction companies have not got behind the notion of sustainable construction development. Now, some have, so I don't want to knock the whole industry, but many, many still haven't. So the construction industry is one global sector that could have an incredibly profound effect on one of those outer circles that I showed you earlier, the environment and even the global sphere, and helping us to achieve our SDGs. And in our project work with different partners, it really falls on our shoulders to be responsible stewards of the resources we have in our control, the materials that we utilize in our production of assets and things like that. So building a clinic, a school, a bridge, really doesn't matter. We have a responsibility to ensure that we're being as conscientious as we can about how our physical capital is impacting on our natural capital. But secondly, we have this chronic problem, and I mentioned this last week as well, of corruption and poor policy making in the developing world. In the exact regions where a lot of this investment in infrastructure is being made, another one is Ethiopia. If you visit Ethiopia, and in fact, a lot of countries in Eastern Africa, it looks like they're under a constant state of rebuilding. They're breaking down buildings and rebuilding buildings, and they're expanding so fast in some of these countries that the air pollution is out of control because of that constant dust and debris in the air from all the construction. And corruption just by itself has a number of challenges for sustainable development. One is that corruption will be a big killer of honest investments, but it can also lead to insidious investments that could potentially harm the most marginalized and harm the environment as well. Like those people living in slum areas who would be affected, or bypassing regulatory frameworks in the country and allowing buildings that are under code or under code materials to be used in construction. And it could wreak havoc on fishing, on forests, on wildlife and conservation areas as well. And we can also see a huge power plants being set up in certain regions. We'll take India, for example, where corruption leads to all kinds of load sharing. And load sharing basically just cutting off power supplies throughout peak times of the day. So rather than increasing the price, they just shut it off. So at dinner time, there's just no power. And what you find is the power is shut off mainly to underprivileged geographic areas. So these areas have little political influence, so they don't have access to one of the key means of production, which is electricity. And this goes on all the time in India. If you don't believe me, I can introduce you to some staff of a livestock project that I set up in southern India. It took 9 months to get hooked up to electricity. And even then, we had to plead with higher authorities to avoid paying huge payoffs to local officials, electrical staff, of even the district offices in that area. And it turned out there are priority businesses, what they call priority businesses, essential services, I guess, that get the electrical output, while others have to bribe or wait for a very long time to get connected. So you can become an essential service if you pay the right bribe, essentially. So the solution is to have stable and sound government policies and complete transparency in how contracts and projects are awarded, just to meet infrastructure demands. So again, we can see that the interaction of the SDGs, as I showed earlier, where there are levels on levels of interactions that need to take place in order to produce not just results, but sustainable results. And I'll end there on the issue of infrastructure. I just wanted to again reinforce that point that the SDGs and the sectors are all linked together. So one can't exist in a bubble or a silo, in other words. And remember, all of the SDGs contribute to that most important SDG 1, okay, the alleviation of poverty by 2030. And if investments around sustainable infrastructure is to be a goal, and it should, to keep up with rising population demands, we acknowledge that, then we need to bring on board one of the world's biggest industries to play ball with the rest of the world's actors, and that's the construction industry. And in my humble opinion, there are ways that project managers, like us, can influence sustainable construction practices through the choice of materials we use, the plans that we propose, the locations we use, the environmental impact that we think it will have, the people that it will affect, doing our due diligence, in other words, and complying with the SDGs. At the end of the day, the point to be made is that the SDGs are profound as solutions to our world's challenges. And they seek to address inequalities. They seek to bring about peace, inclusivity, human rights, gender equality, natural resource protection, environment, climate protection, keep our economy on track. Boy, it's a long list. But remember, all within 15 years, right? 2015 to 2030. And if you think about it, doesn't take a mathematician, we're already a third of the way through it. So if you watch the TED Talks, I posted 2 of them for this week, you'll get a good sense of the challenges overall. But let's layer on top of that progress the fact that we're in a global pandemic, and some are predicting that we've put development back 10 years, which puts it back pre-SDG, if you think about it. Are we going to meet our goals by 2030? Maybe just make a pretty good start on them, maybe? Or at least will it give us some focus for our developmental efforts as planners? I think one of you mentioned that. That's possible. As good policymakers and project managers. Maybe it just points the compass north for us. We don't know. We really don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, Rebecca, go ahead.
I just have a comment, more of a question for you.
Yeah.
Due to COVID, and I mean, because it is 2020, we're coming up to 2021, we really only have 10 years left to make all of the SDGs happen. And so I'm wondering, because obviously I don't think we're going to get there, but I'm just wondering that by the time 2030 comes, do you think that they will come out with a revised version of the SDGs, or do you think they would come out with an entire new agenda and call it a different name, or?
First off, way to be a good optimist.
Sorry, when it comes to stuff like this, especially with development, I try to find a healthy balance between being optimistic, but I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to this because there's just so much. But anyway.
I agree. And I would say, you know, you'll find most practitioners in the field will be of the same mind. I certainly am as well. I think the bottom line is that the SDG platform was so difficult to accomplish, to get, 193 countries on board. They would not want to go through that whole process again. I think rather they would just shove that square peg into the round hole and just try to make it happen. And a lot of countries are on track. Like, I don't want to knock a few of them. Even Canada's pretty well. I think we're over 80% or so on track. But, these are developed countries. So I would say they'll keep on pushing until 2030. They'll do a reassessment and then do another agenda from there.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
That's my guess anyway.
Yeah.
Just for the amount of money and politics involved in trying to revise it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But, before you abandon all hope immediately, because I know some of us do, I'll just share my little pearl of wisdom from, years on the front line in developing countries. And that is, take a targeted approach to where you can have the most impact on 2 or 3 goals. Don't try to, it's those baby chunks, baby bites. Don't try to bite off a big chunk at the same time. And that, have a targeted approach. You can't address everything, but you can make a dent in some of them as a project manager. And you'll have the opportunity every day to engage in those kinds of discussions, planning, monitoring, design, that deal with SDGs on many fronts. So sometimes you can even impact them accidentally, like I described with my rural maintenance program. So it's good to familiarize yourself, figure out how it all fits together, have your favorites, the ones that really make you passionate, and that you really want to work towards. Not for governments around the world. Obviously, they need to focus on all of them, but you don't. That's the good news. You just pick the ones you can, make a difference in, even in your own life. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just, I mentioned earlier, if you're interested, there is a great app, because I'm not going to go after this class to the SDGs in much more detail. This is just really an overview of what the context is for project managers. But if you are interested, there's a great app that you can download. I've got it on my phone, and it keeps track of all your favorite SDGs. You go to Apple Apps or Google Store, and it's called SDGs in Action. Just download the app. The access is free, and it's all up-to-date information on any research you're doing. So if you need access to SDGs really quickly, want to know what's happening, address the question you had, Rebecca, are they going to make any major revisions halfway, maybe in 5 years? That will come up on that app. So you'll get a heads up in terms of what's happening. So, great one-stop shop for all your information needs on that. So I'm not planning to go into the individual goals, but I will be referring to them from time to time, or perhaps I'll draw analogies to issues that we're discussing as we look at how the goals are to be operationalized. That will be my focus going forward, how we put SDGs into action. And of course, this is one of the biggest challenges of the goals, is how to translate them into operational projects that yield results. And I want to play you another video. This one's a bit longer. So this is about 8 minutes, I think, this one. I'm a visual learner, so I wanted something that could take us to a real developing context, a community, in this case, Papua New Guinea, PNG, and relate the development challenges that I visualize, that I see with those SDGs specifically, and something that can put a human face on those global goals that we've just seen, because they feel very esoterical sometimes for me, or very clinical for a select few of people that we really don't understand in depth. So I want you to travel to Papua New Guinea with me. Oh, there's Nicholas's dog. Okay, you did get on your lap. Nice. So let's travel to Papua New Guinea, and I want to explore some community challenges with you and how the SDGs relate to those challenges.
Our journey begins more than 14,000 kilometers from the United Nations in Papua New Guinea as we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which aim to transform our world by 2030. The 17 goals were adopted at the UN General Assembly by 193 member states in 2015. The objective: produce a set of universal goals that meet urgent social, economic, and environmental challenges facing the world. What makes these goals different? Each goal is dependent on the other goals. These goals are universal, integrated, and transformative. The last goal focuses on the importance of partnership between the government, the UN, development partners, civil society, faith-based organizations, youth groups, communities, and the private sector. Despite the many challenges of life in Papua New Guinea, the government and people of PNG are making great efforts toward the SDGs. Progress will be made only if we work together. We begin with one woman working tirelessly to feed her family. Her name is Susan, and today Susan is in a field tending to her crops as her husband fishes nearby in the ocean. For Susan, her 4 daughters, and husband, their crops are at risk as the sea level rise affects the salt level in the soil. This means less access to a variety of food and a greater risk of stunting for her daughters. Susan says she's seen a rise in the sea level and also in the sea temperature here. There are fewer fish, she says. There is no reliable transport infrastructure here either, so the family often skips going to health facilities, even though malaria is rampant. Children are often delivered at home without acknowledging the risk.
2 to 3 hours.
Making matters worse, diarrhea is common here, as proper sanitation practices are rare. Susan has only an 8th grade education. Secondary school is not really an option for her family, as there is no secondary school nearby. Another big concern for her, clean water. The encroaching sea is threatening their water supply with salt. For Susan and her family, she says, their big dream is simply surviving, which has become increasingly difficult. Moving to Enga province, we meet Benny Pundi, a subsistence farmer with 2 wives and 6 children. Health problems are common here because the nearest hospital is far away. Farmers here rely on rain, so their food production is very unstable. The current rain pattern has changed, and it's unpredictable, making it difficult to plant seeds at exactly the right time. They're limited to a few varieties of crops, so their children are often stunted. These same children must also walk great distances to school and rarely attend beyond early primary.
School, not going to school. Yeah. You got no. No around the school close to you. There's a school of Muripe. I'm taking 1 hour, 1 hour 30 minutes.
All of the children help work in the fields. There are no close markets to sell their produce, so everything they grow, they eat. They have no source of outside income. Benny's family uses a basic pit latrine and has no electricity or running water. The family relies on firewood cut from the nearby forest. As for the future, Benny wants only 2 things.
Me lucky 1 plus school now, 1 plus house. I'm told me lucky stuff.
And finally, we move to the capital of Port Moresby and the 5-mile settlement.
My name is Dorothy Robert. My age is 39 and I have 6 children.
Dorothy runs a small food stand she sets up outside her house each morning.
I made my barbecue, selling drinks, sausages, sometimes selling betel nuts.
They have no garden, so they need to purchase all their food. Dorothy is the only person working, so the family is always suffering from a lack of cash. Her husband has other wives and many other children. He gives her no money. This means her children often skip meals, which leads to stunting. There is also no money to buy school supplies, school uniforms, and lunch, so some of the children don't attend school. In the settlement, everyone uses pit toilets, and washing areas are in poor condition when they exist at all. And the water is cut off frequently. Violence against women is a serious issue here. A 2015 Overseas Development Institute article estimates that 2 in 3 women in Papua New Guinea have experienced gender-based violence in their lifetime. Papua New Guinea has the highest prevalence of gender-based violence in the Western Pacific region. Sadly, Dorothy too has experienced violence in her life.
Domestic violence is very commonly in the settlement.
Dorothy feels trapped by poverty. She has dreams, but worries they won't become reality unless her situation improves.
My dream for my children is I want them to be educated, to earn their own living.
These are the stories of real people's lives in Papua New Guinea. The people know that they have rights and are resilient in the face of the adversity they face. Their lives are directly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs are about every single person's life, and improving each life in a powerful way. Betterment of a nation starts with the betterment of one person's and one family's life. The SDGs are the milestone for 15 years. 15 years is an accumulation of days. When you live a life, you live a day. So each single day is important if we want a change. Time alone cannot bring us a change. We are the ones who can and must bring that change.
That's probably one of the best videos I've seen that really sums up how all the SDGs come together in one community. And you saw how they listed all of them. And in one village, they can be impacted so dramatically. And PNG just is an amazing place and amazing people as well. So we have to think broadly. We have to consider all the development challenges that impact that community through our project activities and how it will impact the people positively, as well as not doing additional harm. The do no harm practice is extremely important. So even our best efforts sometimes have to be evaluated carefully so that we don't actually make things worse.